Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. My name is John Potter and we're back with another episode, a quick emergency episode, because again, like we said last week, everything seems to happen and just all the time at the moment with this government. But we have a brand new contributor to the podcast and we are delighted, only slightly nagging on Twitter to be on the podcast, but we are delighted to have Max Wilkinson from Cheltenham. How are you doing, Max?
Thanks, John. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Nice to be here.
And Max, do you want to actually introduce yourself? Because some of the listeners, may not even be aware of particularly how good the Lib Dems are in Cheltenham.
Sure. Well, Cheltenham's a top target seat. The 2019 election, I lost by 981, which is a figure that's emblazoned onto my retinas now, as you might imagine. We are in charge of the Borough Council here with, I think, 30 out of the 40 seats. We've got Borough Council elections coming up next month, and 20 of those Borough Council seats are up for election, including mine. I represent Oakley Ward and I'm the Cabinet Member for Climate Emergency, as well as carrying on as the parliamentary candidate here.
So how are your stress levels at the moment? Are they kind of on an even keel, or is it all with postal votes days away?
I think it's healthy to retain a decent amount of stress during these election campaigns. Whether you think it's going disastrously or whether you think it's going pretty well. So I tend to make sure that I'm feeling a little bit of stress, and then that enables me to get through enough tasks throughout the day, whether that's canvassing in my own ward, delivering a few leaflets in my own ward, or joining one of our other brilliant candidates that we've got. And when you're in Cheltenham, you're targeting all of the seats within the area. So I've got plenty of different places across town to go and canvass, and it's actually very enjoyable this time round, I have to say.
And we will come on to that a little bit later on, but we have to, Max, talk about the main issue that landed yesterday. And as soon as it did, I got so many WhatsApp from people involved with politics to people not involved in politics, and that were the fines that were given out to Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson's wife, also the head of ethics in his in Downing Street at the time. So, I mean, it seemed like my first reaction was, "Holy smokes, this is massive. He can't possibly survive." Since then, we've seen a series of MPs trying to find any possible excuse possible to defend him. But what has your take been on it? Your instant take on it?
Well, it's pretty extraordinary stuff, isn't it? You sort of look at it and you think, how can it possibly be true? And yet it is. And at the point at which the fines were being given out, I was thinking, well, a bit like you, John, probably. They can't survive this. But then after one Conservative MP and another, and then another took to Twitter and the news to say that, of course, the Prime Minister had to carry on with various reasons given. Some of them have been absolutely ridiculous. Look at the man as a whole, they've suggested. Well, I suspect if people on the street look at the man as a whole, they will probably conclude that he shouldn't be the Prime Minister. Others have said, well, what about the war in Ukraine? I'm not sure that Boris Johnson is at the forefront of that response. And then others have just sort of said, well, he didn't do anything wrong. And even like Michael Fabricant talking about how, well, the nurses and the teachers were at it too. And I just find that absolutely extraordinary. The accusation that everyone else was breaking all the rules just because the Prime Minister was. It just doesn't stand up to any scrutiny. The people who I know had an extremely difficult time during lockdown. Personally, my fiancée was, my then partner, now fiancée, was in a hospital having major cancer surgery. I wasn't allowed to visit her after the surgery. I wasn't allowed to attend any of the pre-operation appointments. And it's just quite offensive, really, that the government seems to be suggesting that they can just apologise, tough it out and go on with it. And of course, there may be a few people who stretch the rules here and there, but they weren't the people who were making the rules. And the people who were making the rules need to abide by the rules. That's a fundamental principle of the way politics works. And it's completely shocking. And over the last sort of, 16 hours since the news broke, I've just gone from being astonished to being totally outraged by it. And in Cheltenham, the MP here is a Conservative. He's a Solicitor General, and he's well known in these parts for being a little mealy-mouthed over these sorts of things with the government. He says he's not particularly keen on Boris Johnson, although he's taken a promotion from Boris Johnson into the government to be the Solicitor General. we're waiting to find out what he's got to say. And despite the fact he did say in the past that his red line for resignation from the government would be any unlawful activities by that government, I'm pretty sure he's not going to resign. He will just tough it out with the rest of them. Although I'd be very surprised if he made any comments along the lines of Michael Fabricant, because he's a bit more of a diplomat, and frankly, I think he's got a bit more honour than that.
And maybe a bit more brains than Michael Fabricant. We're allowed to say that. I mean,
and a much smaller majority as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can pick apart some of the rationale, and we're not even going to get to the point that a lot of people don't get to, which is the fact he blatantly lied about it dozens of times in Parliament and in press releases and everything else. So let's talk about. I have something quite distasteful when I hear people say, we can't possibly remove him because of what's going on in Ukraine. There's plenty of precedent through history of prime ministers that have been removed during times of war and crisis, etc. But also it feels like they're somehow using Ukraine, the deaths, the slaughter, the struggle and extra, to almost prop up a man who surely shouldn't be there. And I find that really distasteful, and it almost minimises what the Ukrainian people are going through.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time that the government's minimised what the Ukrainian people are going through for their own purposes, and using Ukraine as a shield, I think, is extremely distasteful, as you've said. I mean, it just doesn't stand up to any level of scrutiny. Even if you think that we shouldn't change our leader as a matter of principle during any kind of conflict anywhere in the world, then what you probably still think is that we ought to have someone at the helm who's able to dedicate all of their time and all of their political capital to actually solving the problem with that conflict. And when you're in a position where the Prime Minister is mostly spending the time that he's got in office defending his own skin, rather than focusing on international affairs and defence, then I think that tells you all that you need to know about the current predicament that we're in. And a former Conservative member who I'm friends with messaged me yesterday just to make that exact point. His view was that the fact that we're engaged, well, we're not engaged in a war, but there is a war that is happening, and the Prime Minister is not able to give all of his time to that because he is answering questions about his own personal conduct. He said, tells you all you need to know.
And it's a moral issue as well. So if you're Britain is going through a whole plethora of crises at the moment, not only with war in Europe, we've got a massive cost of living crisis, and we'll touch on the inflation bills that have figures that have just come out today. We've got the impact of Brexit. We've still got coronavirus killing hundreds of people. To have a prime minister that you cannot trust, who has blatantly lied, seems to have no moral core in him whatsoever, how can the government act in authority in any of these situations going forward if you're thinking, well, the guy just talks rubbish and will lie to you and will knowingly lie to you to do whatever he can whenever he wants?
Well, indeed. And I think if you're in a party which has made it pretty clear that they're not going to get rid of their leader whatever happens, then you're in a really difficult position as a member of that party, whether you're standing as a local election candidate next month, or whether you're standing as a parliamentary candidate, or whether you're an incumbent MP or member of the government. And your own moral compass is then called into question. And indeed, the whole Conservative Party, I think, at the moment looks incredibly weak, particularly, I think, because it styles itself as the party of law and order. And the two people at the head of it now have been found to have broken the laws that they've set during the country's most extreme crisis.
Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Praetor Rains. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Praetor Rains have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Praetor Rains are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Praetor Rains website at praetorians.co.uk/liberal-democrats. Do we think that the heat on Boris Johnson is less because Sunak is involved now? If Sunak hadn't had the week from hell that he's just had and hadn't got a fixed penalty notice as well, do we think Conservatives might be ready to press the button on Boris Johnson? But at the moment, who's lined up to take his place? There is no successor. And will the Conservatives think, look, we might be in for an average to below average local elections coming up. Let's just tie that all around Boris Johnson, then throw him off the cliff.
It's difficult to put yourself in the mind of a Conservative MP, isn't it? And indeed the average Conservative Party member. I don't know what they're thinking at the moment. And I guess unless you're charged with either voting for Boris Johnson to be the leader or keeping him in office, as the MPs are currently doing, it's difficult to work out what they're doing. You suspect that there are probably multiple different positions being held by Conservative MPs, and those will probably range from people who might fancy taking over but not yet, through to people who are the Boris Johnson loyalists, who think that he's still the man who will win in their area. And I guess I look at it from the perspective of someone who's in a blue wall area, and I suspect that MPs in the blue wall are feeling particularly twitchy, particularly those with smaller majorities, because they know that the Liberal Democrats are biting at their heels, and that the Liberal Democrats will definitely hold them to account for the misdeeds of the government. I guess probably we'll find out after the local elections how serious some of the Conservatives are about getting rid of Boris Johnson. From the perspective of someone who's in a blue wall seat, I find that Boris Johnson is extremely unpopular on the doorstep. And one of the things that's characterised this local election campaign so far, and I've been in all of the different wards that we've got in Cheltenham across the multiple different communities, whether it's council estates or whether it's people living in very big houses. And there is a uniform response that's coming back. If you're a hard Conservative voter who's voted Conservative forever, your propensity to vote for Boris Johnson at this election is significantly reduced. So your likelihood of actually turning out to vote Conservative is reduced. But also, if you are someone who is a sort of moderate centre ground voter who may have voted Conservative in 2019 or Conservative at most of the elections, but you're open to voting for the Liberal Democrats, in these elections, you're probably tempted to give the Liberal Democrats a go. And there are a number of people who I'm speaking to, John, who are saying, I will never again vote Conservative.
Yeah. And I was out canvassing in a slightly more Tory-ish area of my ward. So obviously they have a history of us working for them, so two incidents struck out. Firstly, I was just delivering leaflets, and a woman came out saying, "Oh, John, thank you so much for what you're doing, etc. Is it possible I could have a poster for my window?" I didn't even knock on her door, so that was incredible. And the second one was actually, I had a couple come to the door who had, because we canvass every year, and so we knew the track record of these people on Connect, and they had always been Tory voters, always. Maybe 2019, they wobbled a little bit to maybe not vote in terms of, because that was a very good year. And they just came to me and just said, this government is doing everything possible to have a bad election for the Tories. And actually, they took a poster as well, actually. They took and said they would absolutely vote Lib Dem. So that Tory vote seems very soft. There will always be Tories. Even the most ardent of Tories. One guy came to the door and just said, you know what, I just don't care about the party stuff. That is going to happen, but that is not representative of what we're getting on the door. I think this has cut through. So many people sacrifice so much. And I did hear someone say actually that it's almost like this has been a point of release for people. All the frustrations, something had to break in terms of COVID, and some sort of accountability had to happen. And it's happened with Partygate, and people are just venting out their frustrations of 2 years at, well, basically, I can say it's now criminals at the top of government.
Just to pick up on one point there, I'm not traditionally one to give the Conservatives an awful lot of credit without being asked to, or where there's nothing that is concrete to give credit for. But I will. So if we've done a good joint partnership in Cheltenham on something and we've worked with the county council, I'll always say well done. But one of the things that has come up in the discussions in the media on Partygate is people like Jacob Rees-Mogg saying, well, people have moved on now, and it's that people have moved online, and people don't want to talk about it. I think there is a hint of truth that people don't want to talk about it, but that comes with a big caveat. The fact they don't want to talk about it doesn't mean they aren't absolutely furious. And there are enough people who are just sort of, when we're talking about this issue on the doorstep, and it's mostly people raising it with us rather than us proactively saying, how about that Partygate then? People will raise it, and then if you start the conversation, they probably don't want to talk about it at length because they've already decided that they're really annoyed with the government about Partygate. So there is a hint of truth to what Jacob Rees-Mogg and others are saying about that, but it doesn't mean they're off the hook. And they're clearly using that line as a way to seed an idea in people's minds to suggest that they're off the hook. In terms of the way that things have accumulated and problems have accumulated for the government, after the local elections last year, I started knocking roughly at the start of June just to kind of take the temperature. And there was still a decent level of Boris Johnson vaccine COVID bounce at that stage. And in the local election in 2021, we had county and borough and police and crime commissioner elections here. And there was clearly a big Conservative bump there, and turnout was unusually high. And that was almost certainly a bit of a personal vote for Boris Johnson. Yeah. By the time we'd moved on from June, where that bounce was still there, to something to do, I would say, around autumn, October, November time, there was a lot of frustration seeping through. And what I was picking up was that there was frustration around maladministration in government. There was annoyance at the whole Matt Hancock stuff that was coming out. Then and then that was almost like there was a gateway that had opened to people looking at some of the stuff that had gone wrong with PPE contracts and the clear dodginess that there was around the awarding of PPE contracts to Conservative Party donors, members, supporters, whoever, and even Conservative members of the House of Lords, it turned out. And then by the time we got to Partygate and we were knocking on people's doors in the new year, it was almost just like a chasm had opened, and people were willing to look at all of those things in the round and say, actually, these guys and this man, Boris Johnson in particular, they're just not the people who represent me. And I think where the Conservatives are really struggling is that at the moment, it does look to a lot of people like the Conservatives view them with disdain. And that's never a good position for the Conservative Party to be in, or any political party for that matter. I think back to my grandparents, who were lifelong Conservatives. My granddad was a Conservative councillor on Avon County Council. This wasn't something that I was aware of when I was a child, but I found out about it after he died. But they were sort of moderate, centre ground, one nation type Tories. They were definitely political Conservatives. I suspect they were economic Conservatives, and to an extent, like most people from their generation, social Conservatives as well. But what they wouldn't have put up with is the kind of intemperate language, the nastiness, the lack of charitable nature in the current government. I just think that there's absolutely no way my grandparents would have voted for a Boris Johnson-led Conservative Party, which has Priti Patel and Jacob Rees-Mogg in government. Although my grandmother, one of the last times I ever spoke to her, said, that nice, polite young man on the radio. And I was wondering who the hell she was talking about. It turned out she was talking about Jacob Rees-Mogg. She said, he does sound very good and he comes across very well, doesn't he? But I'm absolutely certain that they wouldn't have voted for Boris Johnson. And there must be tens of thousands of people like them out there.
And it's almost unrecognisable. You think of even the Tory party that kind of purged the people like the Ken Clarks and the Dominic Greaves and people like that. This is now just a reincarnation of UKIP. That's how I could do. That has the fringe element, the old guard fringe that people used to roll their eyes at, or David Cameron used to call the swivel-eyed loons within his own party. They are now Boris's backbone in the party, coupled with kind of sycophantic 2019 intake, and it just seems unrecognisable from the Tories. You could think even a decade ago, and it shows the fact that any prime minister in any history within the Conservative Party, can you imagine still being in place right now, given what he's done? I can't.
Absolutely not, because I think the Conservative Party of the past would have held those people to account. And actually, I think there is an issue with the media here as well. And I'm a former journalist, so I don't go around bashing the media very much. But I think in the past, perhaps the media was perhaps a little less docile when it came to the sort of intemperate language and the kind of maladministration that we've seen in the government. You know, they just about got there on the Owen Paterson affair. I think they got there to the point at which they were kind of properly holding the government to account. But there is an awful lot of stuff that is getting through the gaps. Although I have to say that there has been in more recent weeks over the Partygate stuff, and particularly some of the work that ITV has done and the news that they've broken, they've got to the core of things quite nicely.
And it's a funny one as well, because I think for me, the first time I thought, wow, this government's misjudged it really badly, was actually over the sewage stuff in rivers and waterways, because it broke the competence threshold after COVID, and where they marched all their MPs to vote for something, then you turned on it and asked all their MPs to march back down the same hill. And I just thought, at that point, I thought something snapped. So that the idea that even if you don't like the Tories, you can trust them to kind of be competent, to put the economy right, all that. And it just kind of disintegrated with the sewage, and then went on to Partygate, and then everything else, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was just one farce after another. And I think, and I honestly think the Tories are in a really tough spot. I think really important that I believe that Tory voters won't automatically just come across, and I think this is the point of campaigning, and I know me and you are both very active campaigners, is that you've got to give them that nudge. You know, if Lib Dems hadn't worked North Shropshire or Chesham and Amersham as hard as what we did, would we have got those results? Probably not. You've got to give them a reason to switch away from the party, which they'll probably think of as a default.
Yeah, I was chatting to a lady yesterday afternoon, actually, in the Pittville area of Cheltenham, which is one of those areas, like all of Cheltenham, which is extremely close between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. And she said that, you know, she'd considered voting Lib Dem in the past and had a couple of times, but she used the phrase deeply ingrained in her behaviours. You know, the fact that she was a Conservative voter and her parents had been Conservatives. And I suspect she was probably in her mid 80s. And when you think about what it is you need to do to win people's trust, it's not just about saying, the government's dreadful, your local Conservative candidate represents the government and therefore don't vote for them. Although there is an element of that, of course, because anyone who stands as a Conservative in these elections is clearly Boris Johnson's candidate. But as Liberal Democrats, we need to give a positive alternative vision, and we're doing that in Cheltenham. I'm sure you're doing that up in Preston, and there are Lib Dems all across the country who are putting forward either brilliant ideas for their local ward if they are fighting just a few seats actively, or if they're fighting, like in Cheltenham, for the whole of the area, then they'll be putting forward a very detailed manifesto, and our investment in council housing, and we're building the first carbon neutral council homes here in Cheltenham too, our investment in jobs and a new development to work off the back of GCHQ at West Cheltenham with the Golden Valley development, looking at the No Child Left Behind scheme. There are so many areas in which Cheltenham is doing better because the Liberal Democrats are in charge. For us and for the Lib Dems across the country, it's drawing out the fact that the Conservatives are not the people who represent you, the local residents, but also saying, and the Liberal Democrats do represent you, and these are all the good things that we're doing. And that's what sets us apart, because if you elect a Liberal Democrat, you elect someone who isn't going to just win by default because we've got this sort of huge national presence, and that we get in the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and the Express every day, although it has to be said, Ed's on the news quite a lot, and so is Layla these days. But if you elect Liberal Democrats, you get people who will definitely engage with you, who will definitely knock your door, ask you what you think, and then try to reflect that in what they're doing to represent you at the local council house, at the local council offices, or in Parliament, hopefully as MPs in the future.
And that comes back because I always use the phrase, there's no such thing as a Lib Dem safe seat. And if ever a Lib Dem thinks that, they're probably going to lose it pretty soon. But it was really interesting. So I want an update is we've had our first Conservative MP asking for Boris Johnson to resign. So that is Nigel Mills, who Radio Derby, I'm not exactly sure which area, but he's obviously a Midlands an MP. But also, it was really interesting. I watched Newsnight last night. And what Tim Montgomery said quite openly, said, what might do Boris is actually the Lib Dems. And he made it absolutely clear, and I'll quote him directly as what he said. He said, the pressure will come if the Lib Dems do well in the local elections. That's what will put the fear of God into Tories. And so, as far as and they know it, they know whether it's Cheltenham or areas in the suburbs of Preston where I campaign every day or wherever, that it's going to be the Lib Dems hitting the Tories and taking seats off the Tories in May that is going to end this rotten government.
And that's an important role for us to play. And the narrative of the blue wall is something that is really important. And we've built that up with the win in Chesham and Amersham. And if you look at where we're really strong and clearly where we can help have an influence on the result of the next general election, it is largely in Conservative-facing areas in the south of England. Yeah. There are other areas, of course, in Sheffield Hallam will, I'm sure, be really strongly fought by us, but the vast majority of our target seats will be in the south of England in Conservative-facing areas. Yeah. And that is how we retain that relevance in people's minds. Of course, on top of the local activities that we do and the local campaigns that we fight. At the next general election, it's going to be very clear that you'll vote for the Liberal Democrats in the south of England in places like Cheltenham, maybe a little bit sooner in Somerton and Frome, who knows. Those are votes that will definitely count and will have an impact on the outcome. And that gives people a reason to start thinking about the Liberal Democrats in a way that perhaps they haven't for the last few years. And I think Ed in particular is due our thanks because he's doing a really good job of putting us in that position.
And I should just point out, because Tom and Lisa won't forgive me if I do that, obviously there are seats to take on Tories, not just at a national level, but a local level as well, across the country. And, you know, Ed's, I think, in Stockport today with Lisa and Tom. Obviously, Cheadle, Hazel Grove, 2 target seats in the north of England. We want to take off the Tories. But I'm always of the opinion that, there's always a chance for you to make a breakthrough. You know what? And what 2019 showed, when the Lib Dems' massive gains basically ended the May government, is that we were taking seats everywhere. You know, in Preston, we took a seat that had been Tory for like 40 years. And it was that suddenly, because once associations start losing their faith in Boris, they tell their MPs and that goes. But here's a question for you, Max. Do we want Boris to go? Obviously, he's not fit for the job. Ignore the kind of the moral argument that clearly he is a rotten prime minister and he needs to go. But from a political point of view, would you be upset if he hung around till the next general election?
I'll start by apologising to Lisa and Tom, of course. Those 2 seats very key to our success of the next general election. I don't think it's for me to say whether I want Boris Johnson to be in charge of the country. Of course, I don't want Boris Johnson to be in charge of the country, but the Conservative Party isn't listening to me. Ultimately, is going to listen to the voters in those areas like Cheltenham, Cheadle, Hazel Grove, and other
Eastbourne.
Areas.
I'm going to do it, otherwise Josh will complain if I don't say Eastbourne.
Eastbourne, yeah, I mean that's blue wall, isn't it? You know,
yeah, it must be.
But these are important discussions to have. Of course, I don't want Boris Johnson to be in charge of the country for a moment longer, but it's not up to me. The Conservative Party will be ultimately the organisation that decides whether they get rid of him. And all I will be doing is campaigning as often as I possibly can, speaking to as many people as I possibly can, and fighting campaigns that engage with local people to make sure that Boris Johnson's gone as soon as possible. But clearly, there are a number of people who are not going to vote Conservative at this election, who normally would have voted Conservative, because Boris Johnson is in charge of the Conservative Party and in charge of the country. He's not an electoral asset for them anymore. And therefore, it works to our favour politically in the shorter term and perhaps up until the next general election if Boris Johnson remains in charge of the Conservative Party. And now I think what is becoming clear is that the person who was the obvious successor has no real political career left to speak of in terms of seeking high office, because Rishi Sunak lacks the moral authority that Boris Johnson lacks, but for different reasons, it has to be said. Those are more difficult questions for the Conservative Party to have to look at. And if you're looking at then who else might end up in charge, is it Liz Truss? Well, is it really going to be Liz Truss?
Who knows?
I don't think so. They have some other sensible MPs, but all of those people and everyone who is a Conservative MP at the moment is tarred with the Boris Johnson brush, because they've been willing to carry on serving in a Boris Johnson Conservative Party when so many others have decided that that's not the thing for them to do anymore. I suspect in many cases, like Rory Stewart, for moral reasons.
And it'll be interesting to see, because one thing that characterises the success of the Tory party, and we should admit the fact that the Conservative Party is one of the most successful political parties in the world, is the fact that they are ruthless. They are absolutely, if someone's not an electoral asset, they go. Now, in my head, I would think if you want the next leader to have an election right in their honeymoon period, the Tories have got to be thinking about that change at the moment. But I just can't. There just doesn't seem to be the appetite to do it. Now, let's see whether May will change it, and the fact that Rishi's just done himself. I mean, Rishi is completely, his star has fallen so far that it's actually, I almost felt sorry for him, but then I realised he doesn't deserve any of it. But what happens next is going to be really important, particularly as we get onto the next topic, is actually to deal with the cost of living crisis. So just today, as we're recording today, inflation has hit 7%, and for many, many people, that is a huge cut in their living standards. Many, many people, that wipes out nearly a year's worth of not a year's worth, beg your pardon, a decade's worth of kind of pay increases just gone like that. And that is something. Now, whether Partygate cuts across, obviously we are fearing it on the doorstep, but absolutely, if the Tories don't believe that's going to cut across, then the cost of living and the squeeze on people's wallets is very real. It isn't a political bubble, and they are going to have to do something about it if they're not going to get walloped in the general election.
Yeah, and people do notice. It's one of those things where if you're a politician and you're talking about something that's a bit more ethereal, it's something to do with a policy position. Maybe it's even something that's been just passing in the news. If you're one of those politicians and then suddenly you're saying, well, we're in charge of the country and your fuel bill's gone up by, I don't know, X%, depending on what company you're with, right? It's impossible not to have to deal with those difficult discussions. I think the interesting thing is how the Conservative Party will now remake itself to solve that problem, because you mentioned the Conservative Party is ruthless and it's successful. And you look back at various parts of modern history where Thatcher managed to remake the Conservative Party, Cameron managed to remake the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson managed to remake the Conservative Party, all to do very different tasks, but with the same goal to win an election. How will the Conservative Party remake itself to fight the cost of living crisis, which is going to be much more challenging for them, particularly because a lot of the cost of living crisis has been caused by their own maladministration. They'll, of course, try to blame it on the Ukraine war. They'll try to blame it on the pandemic. But in reality, an awful lot of it has been caused by the Brexit promises that they made that were never going to be kept. Yeah. And the Conservative Party now will need to deal with that. The usual tactic would be to blame people in our society who are a little bit weaker and use them as punch bags. And we know who the Conservative Party might be likely to target in those circumstances. But I think I just don't know how they're going to be able to deal with this problem. And part of it, of course, is of their own making as well, because of another key policy which they introduced, which was the energy price cap.
Yeah.
And had that been introduced by a government of another colour, they would have derided it as outrageous socialism. The Conservative Party introduced the energy price cap, and who could have predicted that soon afterwards there would be a massive rise in people's energy bills? And because clearly it's a failed policy and it was never going to work, particularly because they had no wider energy strategy. Yeah. And that's going to be really difficult for them to overcome. And now, of course, they have put an energy strategy in place, but it's not hitting the right notes. And they seem to be still talking about nuclear power generation. And I'm not against nuclear power per se. It needs to be part of the mix, and obviously, definitely will be part of the mix. But what we won't get from nuclear power is new energy being generated anytime soon, because it takes an awfully long time in the UK planning system, quite rightly, to get developments of that size built, and experience suggests that it's going to take an awfully long time. I remember I grew up in Weston-super-Mare in Somerset, and we had a school trip down to Hinkley Point, and I suspect I was probably in year 7, so I would have been, I don't know, 11 or 12 or something, and we were told about this new Hinkley Point power station that might be built. Well, it's still not built, and I'm 38.
Well, I agree. Obviously, I said in the last podcast, I was born and raised near Whitehaven, so Sellafield was right on my door, and I can still remember the jingle they used to play as you went round the visitor centre in Sellafield. So it was, but what the issue is coming in is, do we think that? I mean, lots of people are saying that Sunak is going to be shuffled out now that he's weak enough to. Boris might get rid of him and actually bring someone else in. That new chancellor may, in the autumn statement / budget, introduce new things, give them a little bit of a bounce in the poll. That is also politically quite wise, but also kind of deals with the mistakes I want to say Sunak's made, particularly stuff like the NI rise, and other things that he's almost completely ignored in terms of, I mean, that energy strategy, was he completely ignoring things like insulation, which and energy efficiency, and we understand the Treasury was very much against that. So, but will Boris want someone a more meagre kind of chancellor, someone that will do, because that was originally what people said about Rishi Sunak. Everyone said Rishi Sunak, because when Sajid Javid left and said no honourable member could ever do that job under those circumstances, was obviously a proper slap in the face of Sunak. But then Sunak's kind of stood his ground on some issues and got in the way. But so what's your thoughts about that? Do you think the Tories will biff Sunak in the summer?
I don't know. If you look at some of the news that was coming out just this morning, there was an awful lot of stuff in there about the apparent rows between Sunak and Johnson, and Sunak's people and Johnson's people, and apparent new unpleasant nicknames that Johnson and his friends have for Sunak. I just can't imagine working in an environment where you're supposed to share the same goals and you're on the same team, and giving people such horrible nicknames and being spiteful to one another. How can you seek to run a country in those circumstances? We all know that in political parties, people are not, we're not the Borg. We don't all share exactly the same
heads and have all sorts of disagreements. That's true.
Yeah, right. You can have disagreements, but when you get to the point where you're the two most powerful people in the country and you're sniping at one another, you sort of get the impression it can't go on for much longer, particularly because both parties are particularly weak in that battle now, and Sunak in particular, it's clear that his political career is not going anywhere now. There was big rumours. Sorry, Max, just to say, there were big rumours floating around yesterday that Sunak was going to resign. That was again something that came out. A lot of the journalists said because he didn't respond to any speculation for a long time yesterday, and he was getting requested. Is he going to step down? But then actually the rumours are that he said, well, if you step down, how could the Prime Minister continue if you step down for these reasons? So there's so many weaves and threads being played here in this plot of psychodrama that's happening within the Tory party. Why would he carry on? Why would he carry on though? You'd have to be.
But what would he do with all that money? What would it would be so hard for him.
Well, I mean, it's clear that he's never going to achieve the Prime Minister's role, and therefore, where has he got to go? He's been the Chancellor. He's overcome some big problems, and during the pandemic lockdown, I think he acted most of the time to his credit, actually, and there were some key things that were got wrong by the government. But I agree with a lot of what people say to me on the doorstep, which was it was an incredibly difficult time, and they must have been under a lot of stress. And clearly there is some truth to the fact that there's an awful lot of stuff that could have been got better. And I think the hospitality industry could have been treated an awfully lot better. Self-employed people should have been treated an awfully lot better during that. But also for a Conservative Chancellor to loosen the purse strings like that, I think did show an approach which I think was ideologically sound, because he wasn't tied to his traditional sort of neoliberal right-wing conservative ideology. But when he's come out the other end now, and he's got no moral authority because of all of the family tax decisions that have been made, and now he's been fined for breaking the lockdown rules. Why would he carry on? There's absolutely nothing in it for him. He could go and have a nice, quiet life, probably earn an awful lot more money doing something else. So to carry on, you'd have to be someone who was intent on, I don't know. I mean, I've absolutely no idea why you'd carry on.
Would he not do it just for, a lot of people say, politicians are in it for themselves, but he might have a sense of duty. I don't know. It doesn't appear to be. But, I often say on the doorstep when people say, go blimey, why'd you do what you do? You must get some grief. And I often say, I wouldn't be a Lib Dem in the northwest of England if I was in it for money or power. I do it.
Lib Dem anywhere, would you? If you were in money
that's what, there are easier ways of getting those things. But most politicians, I genuinely believe this. Most politicians do it out of a sense of duty and a sense of wanting to do right by people. But I don't know. I'm with you on it. I just think Rishi Sunak just thinks, I don't need this, and he can go.
Well, surely he must think that, but also, it is quite an extraordinary turn of events where somebody manages to be apparently pursuing citizenship of another country at a time when they're a member of the government. It doesn't really, none of it really stacks up. No. It doesn't make any sense, and perhaps that's what he ought to do. He can go and become a tech mogul in America or whatever, and I'm sure he'd have a much nicer life.
Well, and it does kind of play into the fact that there were rumours for quite a long time that Rishi lacked political nous in terms of he was quite naive, and I think now that another reason why, not just the allegations and stuff, but I think even before these allegations came out, when Partygate first hit, there was rumours that Rishi didn't have like the political cutthroatness or things like that to really get on and become the next leader. But that we will see what happens with that. And in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, we should just say thank Max for coming on. Given that Richard has stood us up, we were going to have the Lord of Liverpool on this, and he actually rang me about 5 minutes ago, so he was only 40 minutes late. So typical Richard. We want to thank Max a lot, and again, all Lib Dems, don't forget postal votes are landing next week. Get a plan in place. Do your postal vote action days. Get them in, get them out, because it might feel really favourable at the moment, but you need to switch those toys. They might not just come across, even in lovely leafy Cheltenham, where you have wonderful councils like that, you still have to do the work. Isn't that right, Max?
Go and knock the hard cons and talk to them. Go and knock up the switch voters between us and Conservative, and just talk. The most important thing that we can do as those who seek office is talk to people and listen, and properly listen, and have decent conversations. I'll leave you with the thought. Yesterday, I had a switcher to us on the issue of vaccine passports, a former hard Conservative voter who was disappointed with the government's approach to vaccine passports. It just goes to show that there are votes out there to be won. People do agree with our general values, but people just don't hear enough from us, and they don't recognise that we are a viable liberal alternative to the government and to the Labour Party, and that actually in places where we have Liberal Democrats, like in your ward, John, and like in Cheltenham and plenty of other places across the country, Liberal Democrats get results for local people. And when we start doing that, and when we prove that we do that, I'm sure we'll be successful. But it all starts with conversations on the doorstep.
Lovely. Well, and with that, Max, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Anyone who wants to follow Max, do follow him on all his socials. Obviously he's a tight candidate, so we are going to have him back on, definitely, because I've promised I'll do an interview talking all about Cheltenham and Max's campaign to be the next Lib Dem MP for Cheltenham. So thank you so much, Max, for coming on. Thank you everyone for watching and listening. Again, you can follow Lib Dem Pod on all your social media at Lib Dem Pod. Do subscribe to the channel, do like and follow and give us a comment. So thank you very much, Max. Thank you very much, listeners and watchers, and we'll be back with another episode very soon.